So, good morning, everyone. This is Eric Hall. I am pastor of Eastchester Church, located in Eastchester, New York. And we have had an incident, as many of you probably are aware, in New Rochelle, which is a neighboring town to us, where, that town now is under lockdown and sort of isolation. And so we have decided as a church not to gather in the building, but to rather gather as a community here online with all of you. The vast number of our attendees are actually those of you from a distance and who come to us by way of Facebook, every single Sunday. So I welcome you all here, and I'm glad we could have the time together. I do think this is a challenging experience for all of us. There's no doubt, and there's a lot of fear and anxiety. But I did want to address this whole issue, a point around the church in the first place. The church is really not the building. The church is the people, and where we are gathered, that is church. To think that we need to be in a building for worship and for praise really is just not in keeping with the teachings or the heart of Jesus Christ. Church is really you and I. And as a Sunday where we are called, to spend time in worship and in resting in the Lord, that can still be done whether or not we go to the edifice called a church or not. Really, for us, I'm sure there's no evidence of this, or I can't, give you any evidence of this, but clearly, whenever you and I go to pray, there's clearly someone on the face of this planet who is praying at the same time we are. And because they are praying at the same time we are, there are two or more of us. And the promise of Jesus is clear. It's simple, but it is very clear. Two or more gathered in my name, and I am there in their midst. And so you and I right now, in and through this broadcast, are united in the Spirit of Jesus, which is ultimately the foundation of the church. We really must get out of this very limited thinking around the power and authority and the scope of God's presence with his people. Yes, the building's important to bring the people of God together because it is the way that we see and recognize and support one another. But also, most importantly, is the fact that Jesus is the underpinnings, the foundation of we who are church. And so we gather this morning in a sacred moment of prayer as a community, and we recognize that you and I are still in the season of Lent, and we are still journeying to the cross and ultimately the empty tomb. Now, many of you know that about a couple weeks ago, I decided that we were going to spend our season of Lent, this time of preparation, talking about us as a compassionate people, talking about us as people who are called to be heartfelt, to be connected to one another, to feel and to empathize to one another. The biblical term for when Jesus, or the biblical image that is presented when Jesus is told to be having compassion for his people, is that Jesus is actually moved to his very depths, and in and through his very depths, Jesus is connected to and caring for and reaches out and stretches out to tend to everyone that is in his presence. So as a Christian community, we talked last week that we're not just called to be humanistic, meaning that we're meant to simply be kind to one another. We talked about how very often we think that when we talk about being compassionate or being Christians called to compassion, we're simply talking about not yelling at each other in the parking lot as we're leaving a food store. But the reality is that so much more is required of us, and it is to replicate and to imitate the heart of Jesus Christ himself. And so for you and I, this season of Lent and our reflections upon compassion really is about, how do we embody this in ourselves? How do we allow ourselves to be open to the grace and the presence and spirit of Jesus, and to allow that experience to transform us, to fill our souls that sometimes are filled with so much other junk, and really sort of blocks God's way of filling us with his love. Because really, for Christians, this isn't meant to be a work. This isn't just meant to be a discipline. This should be, this act of compassion should be something that we are readily and freely and almost unknowingly giving to one another. And why? Because you and I experience to such an extent that it just simply is an overflow of our experience of God's love for us, that it then drives us out to love one another, but most importantly, recognize that that happens after you and I, love ourselves. And we've talked about that a little bit last week as well. So here we are as a Christian community all around the world, gathered in a moment of worldwide crisis and pandemic. This issue and crisis and disease, the coronavirus, is gripping all of us from coast to coast, from, by and enraptured by this experience of this coronavirus. And it is very real. And there is definitely an importance to each of us following through and being faithful to the guidelines that have been presented to us by people who are probably much smarter than you and I about exactly what it is we need to do to be caring for ourselves, and also in this case specifically caring for one another, because we realize that any one of us could be a carrier of this disease and virus and not even realize that we are, and thereby our encounter with others could bring about a harmful effect to them without even our intention. And so one of the reasons why I do believe, the church, we as Christians, and I would say this isn't just proper to us, but our brother and sister Muslims, our brother and sister Jewish, worshipers, equally, the one thing all of us have in common, the one term that is found in all of our traditions, is this term around compassion. And so it is compassionate for us to be listening to authorities and to try to be faithful to what is being asked of us for our own health and also for the health of our brothers and sisters. There have been significant videos posted on Facebook, on YouTube, on TikTok, and two videos in particular really have sort of caught my eye and have caught my attention. The two are extreme distinctiveness, two very unique positions and responses, if you will, to this coronavirus. But both, I think, are indicative of exactly how you and I can choose to respond as a people of faith at this specific time and this specific crisis. And let's be clear, for all of us, there is fear, there is anxiety, there is stress, there is worry, there is this sense of a need to be defensive and to try to make sure that we're safe and our loved ones are safe, and so with all that, there is this crisis that has manifested not just in society but also in each and every one of us. Back to the videos. The one video that I found very disturbing and caught my attention was the video, and perhaps you have seen this, where there are people shopping in a store somewhere, and there is a person who has a shopping cart filled with numerous multi-packs of toilet paper. I'm not really sure what the focal point is around toilet paper during this time. I'll leave that to others to comment on. However, this woman has in her cart a significant number of packages of 10-pack, 20-pack toilet paper, and she is waiting in line to purchase those on her way out. And another person comes up, another woman comes up behind her, and she asks her, listen, would you mind very much? I could really use one of those. Can I have it? And really what follows is a bit of a battle between the two people, where the one woman who has already obtained these and put them into her shopping cart, is yelling at the other one to leave them alone, not to touch them, Now, perhaps, the woman has a very large, significant family. And if that is the case, then she is justified in buying the toilet paper that she needs to provide for her family. But if rather it is simply that um, there is this survivalistic and isolationist attitude, around this crisis, that it's about me and not about anyone else. Really, there is this problem that we have about, what is it that you and I are called to do at this point as Christians in this regard, and it is challenging to be compassionate during this time. It is hard to have empathy for one another and to share. Perhaps, again, I'm not judging the individual. She may have absolutely every need for that. She might have been buying it for her family. She might have been buying it for her friends. I mean, we really don't know the situation. However, the way it looks is probably the way you and I have reacted to it, and that is that we think that this is something that the woman is simply trying to hoard and she's not willing to share. I'm not willing to go that far. However, I do think there is an attitude, perhaps not proper to this situation, but there is this attitude that is coming across now as we are all running into and rampaging stores to try and store up for ourselves everything we want and everything we feel we need and everything that we think is incredibly important. We have taken the challenge and the directive to be distancing from one another, to mean that we are meant to be isolationist, that we are truly meant to be in a survivalist mode, and it's about me and about nobody else. And clearly, for the Christian, we're really called, especially now, especially in this time when it is not easy for us to look beyond ourselves, when it is not easy to overcome our own fear and to see the other person. It is specifically during this point in time that we are called to be compassionate, to feel, and not only just to empathize, but to respond to the needs of others. It is intriguing, and as I was reflecting on some thoughts to share with all of you today, the thought that came to me, is that, Jesus's command: if you have two tunics, give to the one who has none. And there does seem to be this opportunity for us as Christians, as we're asking ourselves, what is it that we are meant to be doing during this time, is to be considering what is it that we have that we should be sharing with others as well. This state of distancing that we are called to as a world right now, and again, in order to avoid the spread or the rapid spread of this coronavirus, does not mean that we as Christians do nothing. It does not allow us any type of an excuse not to be reaching beyond ourselves and caring for others. There is a situation we find ourselves in that we are probably more deeply ingrained in mass communication than ever before. Look at us here. Here I am sitting in my home office in Glen Cove, New York, projecting and sharing a message and a word to all of you. And clearly, we all use these social media devices to share with each other where we would go for lunch, what are we having for dinner, the new shoes we bought, the vacations we're on. Well, what about using these types of communication simply to reach out to one another and wonder how we are all doing? That is an act of compassion. Have you asked your family members, how they're doing? Have you reached out and asked them if there is anything they need? My wife is an amazing individual. She learned from her cousins up in Poughkeepsie, New York, which is probably about 2.5, 3 hours from where we are here in Glen Cove on Long Island. That her cousin was having a hard time finding children's medication, for her kids because, they were suffering with colds and coughs. And she went to all the stores up in that area and she really could not find anything. And so, my wife early this morning gets up, and besides going out for a bagel run for all of us here in the house, she also went to the stores and she tried to identify and find, some medicine that she was able to pick up. And she did indeed find, 2 bottles on a shelf, and she purchased them. And her intention is later today to go and to mail them up to our family member up there. A simple act, a simple going out of your way for someone else, but one that really meets a need of somebody else, one that is very simple to do, and one which, by the way, does not break any of the barriers or the obligations or responsibility we have to try to stay, distance one from another. Have we really taken the chance, to ask our friends, our neighbors, elderly, the handicapped, those who are homebound? Have we picked up a phone? Have we asked them what is it that they need? How are they handling the crisis? How do they feel? Because so often, so very often, it's not about material needs. Sometimes the way to be most compassionate is simply to be reaching out and to let someone else know that they are not alone, that they are cared for, that somebody else has taken the time to actually think about them and to reach out to them. And so, there are plenty of opportunities for us as Christians, and as Jews, as Muslims. There are plenty of opportunities for you and I to be compassion, to embody compassion, yes, in this specific time and in this specific instance. And once you begin to share your concern and your presence and your supportive concern for one another, you'll find that your own fears, your own anxieties, we begin to diminish. Because you'll realize, and so often for us, when we end up in a crisis like this, we just don't know what to do, and we feel helpless. And when we feel helpless, it contributes to our anxiety, to our stress, to our worry, and to our isolation. And really, when we end up reaching out to one another, we realize that that is simply not the case. That what does happen and what really transforms us is by forgetting about ourselves and caring for someone else. Being compassionate with ourselves, but then also sharing that compassion with others as well. And finally, and definitively not least, though it is the last in this list, as we talk about, this video that we're sharing about the toilet paper battle, the toilet paper war that took place in the store, is really compassion requires you and I now to pray. When did we ever think that prayer was absolutely the last thing for us to do? When did we actually think that prayer was the least we could do, or is so minimalistic, almost as if prayer does not make a difference? And those of us of faith, recognize that we are in relationship with a God who hears and answers prayers. And for us, you and I, as Christians, if we do nothing else, there is this challenge to be more prayerful. And perhaps you, like I, the first couple of days of Arthur not going to school and us sitting home and not going into the city for work and trying to work from home, there's a bunch of stuff we want to do. There's that cabinet we wanted to rearrange. There's extra laundry we wanted to get out of the way. And oh, by the way, there's that new movie that we really wanted to see on TV. And perhaps you and I realize now that after we end up with all of this free time that we always wanted, and we had all these things to do, that you and I realize now that, okay, now what do we do? And perhaps this is the most crucial contribution that this event can make to us as members of the human race. It might be actually for us to all slow down a little bit, to begin reflecting more on our life. Reflecting meaning simply observing it, recognizing it. And maybe as people of faith, this is the gift to you and I, that this gives us the time maybe to do spiritual reading, to sit with the Bible, or maybe, and I have preached about this significantly for years, maybe it simply allows you and I time to sit with and in the presence of Jesus, and to allow his love and his concern and his compassion to transform, each and every one of us. If we do nothing else during this time of crisis to contribute and to be compassionate to the rest of the world, let us be people of prayer. Let us be people of reflection. The second video that, really stunned me, reminded me of, the time here in New York during September 11th. September 11th here in New York City, and probably other parts of the country, as well, perhaps even other parts of the world, was a startling time for us. The city was shut down. There was no way of traveling anywhere or doing anything or engaging. People were scrambling, to try and find out, how many boxes of pasta they could get so that they can, eat, because they realized that you weren't going to be able to go out. There was this enormous sense of fear that came about, and people were afraid. People were really afraid, and streets were empty, and this was the initial response. People hid. But then we were encouraged, each of us, to overcome our fear. And our leaders, encouraged us to overcome our fear. And in being encouraged to overcome our fear, there was this transformation that led from us being afraid and hiding in our apartments and in our homes to reaching out and to caring for one another. This is a same situation and a scenario. It's a same dynamic that probably takes place, during national disasters, during, when horrible events such as shootings take place. It immobilizes. The initial reaction is to immobilize the area because people don't know what to do. And because it's so extraordinary, and because it is so terrifying, and it is so unnerving, we end up shutting ourselves down. And we should be compassionate with ourselves and accept the fact that perhaps up until now, you and I have not made the best decisions, about how to care for ourselves and how to care for one another. And we simply have to allow the reality that you and I are human beings, and regrettably, we don't always make the right choices. However, there may come a time where you and I find that we are getting our feet back under us, and we are feeling stronger, and we are realizing that this perhaps isn't as bad or as horrific as we thought, and we might end up, stepping out and reaching out to one another. The video that I was referring to that started this conversation was the people, perhaps you've seen it. I think it's outrageous. It's incredibly beautiful. It's the people singing from the balconies in Rome. Apparently, at least from what I can sort of just piece together, is that someone started playing an aria from one of the operas, and obviously clearly had their windows and their doors open of their balcony, and what ends up happening is the sound just echoes because there's no one on the street. There's no other sounds to muffle the music, so the music just emanates down the street, and what you see happening is people emerge out of closed and locked doors to stand out on their balcony. And then you'll see one voice lends to another, and then the two lend to two more. And the video is of a street, of people on their balcony, clearly distancing healthily, right? So that they're distinct from one another. But there is this movement that has taken place. The one person who started playing the aria and the others who started singing encouraged others to come out and to participate and to really connect with one another. And if there's something about this crisis, it might be the fact that it reminds us that we are people, and that as people we are connected to other people. And unlike certain crises that only impact, whether it's a natural disaster or something like September 11th in New York City, that maybe mostly impact one specific geographical area, this coronavirus is impacting the world. And as such, is it possible that this coronavirus will actually drive us to be more in relationship with ourselves, and also therefore more in relationship with one another? Is it possible that the value and the benefit that came out of September 11th and some of these events where people end up really recognizing and seeing one another? Remember last week I preached about, the way compassion starts is that you actually have to be able to recognize there's a person. You have to recognize that there's somebody else that we actually should be caring about. We have to move beyond just seeing ourselves and our needs to seeing the other. Is it possible that this coronavirus moves the world away from all the technology and all the stuff and busyness that we make ourselves believe is so much more important than everything else? And that this health crisis really gets us to recognize that what is important is the fact that the reality that you and I are people, and that as a person we are connected to others, that they are us, and we are also equally them. As you and I begin to reflect as Christians, as Jews, as Muslims, what is our response? How are we meant to embody compassion? Let's consider some of what we've talked about here this morning. Let's consider that, there are no big dramatic needs at this point. There's no dramatic heroism that is required. Sometimes it's as simple as being a hero to one other person that transforms the whole world. And perhaps as Christians, it is one simple act of compassion that drives others to do the same. So as you and I gather on this Sunday, this holy day, this day where we recognize and we celebrate God's presence in our life, where we take the time and we reflect on all that God has done for us, we recognize that God is not giving us the virus. I've already seen evangelists, with this message, and I feel bad for them because clearly they do not know and they have not experienced the love of this Jesus of Nazareth, this Jesus, the Son of the ever-living God. Because if they experience that love, they know that God's not the foundation and the former and the giver of this to punish us. God is working in and through the experience to help us come to a resolution, to come to a cure. And so we call upon the name of our loving and compassionate God to give us strength and to give us courage, to guide all of the researchers worldwide who are scrambling to try to determine how do we cease the exposure of this virus? How do we minimize its effects? How do we get it under control? We ask for God to inspire each and every one of them. And for all of our first responders, and here I'm not just referring to police and EMS and fire, they clearly deserve and have gained for themselves that title, but first responders in this case will also be our hospitals, all of the doctors, all of the nurses, all the chaplains, all the staff. They each have been called upon and are being called upon here in this area, but also all around the world, to truly put themselves in harm's way, to bring about healing and comfort for another person. They are the hands of compassion that we are looking for. They are the hands of compassion that we look to for an example. And so we pray for them and we ask that God would keep them safe and keep them protected, and that God would work in and through each and every one of them in profound ways over the next couple of weeks to really make a difference, to increase their capacity to make a difference, and to give them strength to continue loving and hoping, even when things may appear to be so incredibly difficult. On behalf of all of us here at Eastchester Church, again, I am Eric Hall. I'm the pastor broadcasting from my home in Glen Cove because we have closed down this day the church, the building of the church. But if any of you notice right now, there are dozens of us who are gathered in prayer at this time, supporting one another and reassuring one another that we're not alone. And yes, God loves us all. God bless you.